today, I want to talk about some themes that have been coming up in previous podcasts. And I want to talk about, and in previous podcasts, I have talked about films. And I think you know how much I love films. So I'm going to illustrate some of my points with everyday films, because films contain references to mythology and they're very symbolic. So I'm going to talk about mythology first. So we have talked in the podcasts about how the 12-step people, they believe the only way to deal with the cravings, addictive cravings, is to ask the loving God to take away the cravings, the God in the sky, the Father God. Now, I want to suggest that addictions are often associated with another God. I mean, it's a very powerful God or symbol, because we're talking about symbols today. It's associated with a very powerful symbol. And that symbol is Dionysus, also known as Bacchus. The Romans, later, they changed his name to Bacchus. And you've probably heard of bacchanalians and orgies and drugs and sex and all kinds of stuff that people get addicted to. So now Dionysus, as you probably know, was the Greek god of wine and intoxication, amongst other things. Now, and there are cults that celebrated him. There were mystery cults. You get initiated into them, And so part of the reason I believe that people engage in, intoxication is that it connects them with that, want to call it divine, whatever. It connects with that energy, So it's very difficult to counter that, and that's a powerful God. It's a powerful symbol, and to combat that with this supposed loving God, it doesn't quite work for me, and it doesn't work for many people. Now, there's a lot more stuff about Dionysus, that we'll probably come back to in future podcasts. Now, since we're talking about mythology, and that this is an image, this is a symbol, this is an image from Greek mythology. But you don't have to just go to Greek plays to see those archetypes, what Jung called archetypes, in action. See them in contemporary films. And I will mention a film that has come up in previous podcasts. Remember, we had, when I was reading out the letter from my friend, we saw it Star Wars style, And Star Wars connects to us in a couple of ways. One, Carrie Fisher was in it. Two, Star Wars is very symbolic. And it even connects to Jung, Carl Jung, and it connects to Jung through Joseph Campbell. Now, Jung has the concept of shadow. Shadow is the dark side, and one of our tasks is to become aware of the shadow, but not give in to it. If one gives into it, one becomes it. One loses one's identity. And you can see that's what happens to Anakin Skywalker. He gives in to shadow and he loses his face. He becomes the mask, the dark mask. Okay? And you see that the struggles and the acknowledgement of shadow very clearly in all of the Star Wars movies. Now, as I said, there is a link, a direct link, because Star Wars, director was George Lucas. George Lucas was a friend of Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was a mythologist. And he was a Jungian, but he was not a psychologist Jungian. He looked at myths, stories, symbols, gods. He talks quite a lot about Dionysus, and he talks about the mystery cults in his books. His most famous book is Hero with a Thousand Faces. He talks about how in completely different cultures and different times you have heroes, but they are very similar in their tasks and in how they're born and what they do. And he talks about, Joseph Campbell actually talks about the 12 stages of the hero. And you can see that in Star Wars very clearly, that Luke Skywalker, he doesn't want to leave his family at first because he's in the ordinary world. He doesn't want to go on this exploration to discover all of this stuff. He says no at first. He refuses the call, but then something happens and he has to go. And then he gets his mentor, and then he goes into there's a task, and he has to battle evil, and he has to see shadow in himself, but not give into it. All of that happens. You can see that in most stories. You see that's how stories develop. Now, Campbell had been lecturing, written about this stuff. George Lucas and him met, and Campbell saw all the Star Wars films. He advised George Lucas, and they became very good friends. So there is a direct link between Star Wars and Carl Jung, via Campbell. And you'll also see there's a lot of Buddhist images and we've talked about Buddhism before. There's a lot of Buddhist images in Star Wars. Yoda is a Zen master. It's like the Force. What is that Force? It's Zen, So we've got all of that. And remember the one where he's blindfolded? That's again, apparently, Zen masters use that for fencing and stuff. They blindfold the student. So there's a lot of stuff there that comes from Eastern mythology. So that's Star Wars. Now the next one, and I used to talk about this in my lectures, Batman. See, because a lot of students were familiar with Batman, and Batman very clearly illustrates the concept of shadow. Because and I used to ask my students, and there's one film that shows it very clearly. It's Batman Begins. I used to talk about this even before that film came out. But Batman Begins very clearly illustrates my point. And I would ask students, how did Batman become Batman? And somebody would put up their hand and say, he saw his parents killed when he was a child in the alley. And I said, yeah, that's what happened. Now, in Jungian terms, you see your parents killed, you're a child. That will lead to hatred, vengeance, bitterness. This is dark stuff, shadow, Now, he could have been eaten by that stuff and gone into shadow and become a criminal. And I used to say that. I said, look, he had that path open to him if he had just given into shadow, and you see it in Batman Begins. He actually steals. Remember, in Tibet or somewhere, he steals, It turns out he's stealing from his own company. But he becomes a criminal for a little while, but then he backs off because he becomes aware, The other guy, the other bad guy, doesn't become aware. But what Batman does, what Bruce Wayne at the time, what he does is he becomes aware of what is happening, And if with awareness of shadow, then you can channel that energy positively, So in our everyday lives, remember, we've been talking about rechanneling addictive energy. We've been talking about rechanneling shadow. So what Bruce Wayne does is he rechannels it into fighting evil. And he comes up with, the whole, Batman. And I used to ask my students, what is his persona? And somebody would say, his persona is actually Bruce Wayne. Because that's what he shows the world. He doesn't want people to know who he really is. He wants them to think he's a drunken billionaire. Because that allows him to gain, that allows him to achieve his tasks. So you can see a lot of these Jungian concepts about symbols, they show up in everyday films. So we've got, Star Wars, we've got Batman. Now, I'm going to move into a slightly different genre of film now. And this is also a film that deals with shadow, but it deals with shadow from a slightly different angle. It's like persona shadow. And this was a film by David Lynch. And David Lynch himself, as a person, he has gone towards religion, transcendental meditation. He was gone, but his films, his early films, you can see that he was struggling with how to cope with shadow, And in this film, Blue Velvet, you'll see it starts off with the facade. Middle class America, you've got white picket fences. You've got clapboard houses. You've got neighbors waving. You've got firefighters waving. You've got everybody smiling. You've got Dalmatian dogs. And then he takes you on this journey. What's behind all of that? And behind all of that, there is shadow. Okay? Behind all of that, there is drugs and sex, and and there's this evil guy, with the mask, played by Dennis Hopper, and he's breathing in gas, So and you follow that journey. Now, it is a symbolic journey, but it's approached in a different way than the films we talked about before. The films we talked about before, they go right into myths. They're set in their fantasies. They're set in other worlds, in other galaxies. This is showing the shadow in our everyday life. And in a way, I have been talking about how when I drive around or walk around and I see buildings and I see shopping malls, I go, this is a facade. This is the shopping mall, but there is stuff going on behind it. That civilians may not be familiar with, may not be aware of. That there's drug deals going on in parking lots, and and there's motels, and there's all kinds of stuff going on. So now the final film that I want to talk about, and we're moving a little bit farther away from our theme, but it's still dealing with shadow and the dark side, and it shows you that addictions are very deep, and they go a lot deeper than things like money, and that's the point I want to make about gambling. And I have been making that point throughout these podcasts, is that gambling is a very powerful addiction because it it's not about money. It goes a lot deeper than that, and it's not just about the high too. There is a very, very high, but there's underlying stuff, And the movies I want to talk about, there was one done in 1970, and then it was remade about 4 or 5 years ago. The one in 1970 was called The Gambler, and it was with James Caan and a young Faye Dunaway, and he prayed. And another reason that I'm talking about this is it's personal, because I could relate to it. He was a psych prof, who had a gambling addiction, and a very bad gambling addiction. And you'll see, if you see the movie, and it's not about money. He came from a very wealthy family, There's all kinds of stuff going on there, There's psychodynamic stuff, and there's, and in the very end, he gets out of it, but he gets out of it after many, many trials, So he is a hero, but he had to go on that journey, And it was remade about 5 years ago with Mark Wahlberg. And he plays a psych prof, and he's having an affair with his student, Brie Larson, pre-Captain Marvel, before her Captain Marvel role, a younger Brie Larson, and she's very good in it. But and you see again, it's a harrowing movie. I mean, it's really, it gives you the shadow behind gambling. You see it, you see that gambling is not about money, it's not frivolous. So those are just some movies that I've tried to link them. I guess the main link is they're symbolic and they're about shadow in one way or another. And that's it for today.